The world is on edge as one of the most explosive geopolitical standoffs in decades unfolds. The United States claims a breakthrough that could redefine the balance of power in the Middle East, while Tehran hits back with a stark denial. Energy markets are swinging, alliances are being tested, and every move could ignite a chain reaction felt across the globe. President Trump announces what he calls productive talks with Iran, a claim Tehran insists is entirely fabricated. Here's what's happening, and why the stakes are higher than ever. Trump's alleged breakthrough. Tehran denies all contact. In a stunning development that sent shockwaves through global media and political circles, US President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum to Iran. President Donald Trump claimed what he described as a significant diplomatic breakthrough with Tehran, asserting that productive talks had taken place that allowed the United States to pause planned attacks on critical Iranian infrastructure. Speaking to reporters in an unusually dramatic address at the White House, Trump emphasized that the conversations had opened a door for a potential de-escalation of the intense military and political tensions that have gripped the Middle East for weeks. According to Trump, these discussions provided reassurance that a catastrophic escalation could be avoided, framing the US response not as a sign of weakness, but as a demonstration of calculated strategic diplomacy in the midst of high-stakes conflict. Trump's declaration immediately dominated news cycles, reverberating across international markets and political forums. US officials echoed the president's statements, suggesting that the pause in strikes was not only a measure to prevent further loss of life, but also a deliberate move to create breathing space for dialogue. Analysts in Washington speculated that this talks narrative could serve multiple objectives, presenting the Trump administration as a responsible actor on the world stage, stabilizing energy markets that had spiked due to the conflict, and preempting criticism from both domestic and international observers concerned about military escalation. Despite the fervor in Washington, the reaction from Tehran could not have been more diametrically opposed. Iranian state media, government officials, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, collectively rejected the White House's portrayal of the situation, labeling the claims as fabricated and a deliberate attempt at misinformation. High-ranking officials in Tehran insisted that no direct communication with US representatives had occurred, emphasizing that Iran would not engage in unilateral discussions under the threat of attack. The Iranian parliament speaker described the narrative as a distortion designed to manipulate public perception and international opinion, while other senior figures warned that any attempt to frame Tehran as negotiating in secret would only deepen mistrust and risk further destabilization of regional security. This divergence between the US and Iranian narratives created an extraordinary level of uncertainty. International observers were faced with two sharply conflicting stories, one in which diplomacy appeared to be actively diffusing a crisis, and another in which Tehran positioned itself as resolute against external pressure, denying any dialogue whatsoever. The discrepancy has sparked widespread debate among foreign policy experts about the actual state of negotiations, if any exist, and the credibility of public statements from both governments. Some analysts suggested that even if informal backchannels were operating, public denials from Tehran may be a strategic maneuver to maintain domestic cohesion and demonstrate strength in the face of perceived US aggression. Meanwhile, media coverage and social media amplification have magnified the sense of drama. Headlines splashed across international news networks portrayed Trump's announcement as a potential pivot point in the Middle East conflict, while Iranian outlets pushed back with equal intensity, emphasizing the supposed falsehood of the US account. The resulting media clash has contributed to widespread confusion among the public and policymakers alike, as citizens, investors, and diplomats attempt to pass fact from political theater. The atmosphere of ambiguity has been particularly acute for energy markets, which remain sensitive to any signs of escalation or de-escalation. The stakes surrounding these allegations are exceptionally high. US military planners had prepared for a series of strikes targeting Iran's energy and infrastructure sectors, a move intended to pressure Tehran while minimizing civilian casualties. The announcement of a halt, framed as contingent on diplomatic progress, temporarily eased fears of immediate attacks, but the lack of verification from Iranian authorities means the international community is left navigating an exceptionally fragile situation. Global leaders have expressed cautious optimism, while also urging both sides to provide clear, verifiable communication to avoid miscalculation. The risk of misinterpretation or unilateral action remains elevated, with analysts warning that even a minor incident could reignite hostilities. At the core of the dispute lies a fundamental question of credibility. US officials insist that Trump's announcement reflects genuine progress and a desire to reduce tension, portraying the pause as evidence that diplomacy can still function under extreme pressure. In contrast, Tehran frames the claim as a deliberate deception, accusing Washington of attempting to present an image of control and goodwill that does not reflect the reality on the ground. The resulting standoff of narratives has transformed what might have been a simple operational pause into a geopolitical chess match, with each side vying to shape perception and strategic advantage. The divergence in messaging has also fueled speculation about Trump's motivations. Some observers suggest that the president's public pronouncements may serve domestic political purposes, reinforcing an image of decisive leadership, capable of navigating volatile international crises. Others argue that the statement reflects a calculated effort to stabilize markets, particularly oil and gas sectors, which have experienced significant volatility since the escalation of US-Iran tensions. Meanwhile, Tehran's denial can be read as an assertion of national sovereignty and internal cohesion, signaling to domestic and regional audiences that Iran remains steadfast despite external pressure. As the world watches the unfolding drama, experts warn that the situation remains exceptionally fluid. While Trump's claim of productive talks offers a tantalizing glimpse of potential de-escalation, the complete denial from Tehran casts a shadow over the narrative, underscoring the profound mistrust and strategic calculation that characterize the conflict. International observers are closely monitoring both public statements and intelligence indicators to assess the real likelihood of meaningful dialogue, mindful that the line between diplomacy and military confrontation remains perilously thin. US pauses strikes on Iranian energy grid amid global tension. In a decision that sent immediate reverberations through international energy markets and geopolitical circles, the United States announced a temporary halt to planned strikes targeting Iran's critical energy infrastructure. The move, framed by the White House as a strategic and precautionary measure, comes after weeks of escalating tensions in the Middle East, during which US military and intelligence assets had prepared for potential attacks on Iranian power plants, pipelines, and other energy facilities. According to officials in Washington, the pause is intended to allow for potential diplomatic engagement, while avoiding an immediate escalation that could have catastrophic consequences for the region and global supply chains. President Trump presented the pause as a decisive, yet measured step, claiming that the US had obtained assurances through unspecified channels that discussions with Iranian counterparts were underway and showing promise. Speaking from the White House briefing room, Trump emphasized that halting the strikes did not signify weakness, but rather a strategic choice to preserve lives, infrastructure, and regional stability. He described the decision as a necessary window for diplomacy, stressing the importance of timing and coordination in executing military operations at the international level. The announcement immediately affected global energy markets. Oil futures, which had surged amid fears of strikes on Iran's extensive energy network, experienced a notable decline, reflecting investor relief at the perceived reduction in immediate risk. Analysts highlighted that the temporary pause was interpreted as a sign that the US was willing to explore alternative measures before resorting to direct military action, though uncertainty persisted over whether Tehran would respond favorably. This uncertainty contributed to volatile trading patterns, with some investors expressing cautious optimism and others warning that the geopolitical risk remains exceptionally high. Despite the ostensibly positive framing from Washington, the Iranian response sharply contradicted the US President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum to Iran. Narrative. Officials in Tehran rejected claims of ongoing talks, describing the announcement as a misleading portrayal designed to manipulate international perception and project an image of US control. Tehran's government asserted that it had not engaged in direct negotiations with American representatives and that any threat of strikes would be met with strong resistance, including potential retaliatory measures. Iranian state media emphasized that the pause could not be taken as a genuine sign of de-escalation, highlighting a deep mistrust of US intentions and signaling the potential for continued tension. The implications of pausing strikes extend far beyond immediate military considerations. Iran's energy infrastructure is a cornerstone of the national economy, and any disruption carries significant consequences for domestic electricity supply, water distribution, and industrial output. Analysts noted that US planners were acutely aware of the potential for civilian suffering, and the decision to pause operations may reflect a combination of ethical calculation and strategic prudence. Nevertheless, the lack of verification from Tehran means that the window for diplomacy is uncertain, leaving global observers and regional allies on edge. The timing of the announcement was also politically charged. US leaders face pressure both domestically and internationally to demonstrate effective crisis management while avoiding actions that could inflame conflict. By emphasizing the pause as contingent on productive dialogue, the administration seeks to project a message of controlled decision-making and responsible leadership. At the same time, critics argue that the move may be largely symbolic, a public relations maneuver designed to stabilize markets and political optics, rather than a reflection of substantive progress toward resolution. Across the region, allied nations are carefully monitoring developments. Israel, for instance, continues to conduct operations targeting Iranian positions, signaling that the pause announced by the US does not automatically extend to all military actors in the region. Gulf states are evaluating the implications for shipping lanes, energy exports, and regional security dynamics, acutely aware that any misstep could reignite full-scale hostilities. Analysts warn that, despite the temporary relief offered by the pause, the situation remains highly volatile, with potential flashpoints capable of triggering broader conflict. Strategically, the decision to suspend strikes on Iran's energy grid can be seen as a high-stakes gamble. On one hand, it allows time for potential negotiation, reducing immediate risk, and providing a breathing space for diplomatic channels. On the other hand, it introduces uncertainty and exposes Washington to criticism should the pause fail to yield tangible results or be perceived as weakness by adversaries. Iranian denials intensify this uncertainty, illustrating the profound mistrust that defines US-Iran relations and highlighting the challenges inherent in translating public statements into verified, actionable outcomes. From a humanitarian perspective, the pause offers a brief window to prevent disruption to civilian infrastructure, including power and water systems that millions depend on. Military analysts have emphasized that striking such infrastructure could provoke widespread civilian suffering, complicating international responses and potentially violating established norms of warfare. By delaying the strikes, the US can signal a willingness to prioritize humanitarian considerations, even amid intense geopolitical competition, though skepticism remains high given the ongoing rhetoric from Tehran. The announcement has also prompted intense speculation about the broader strategic calculus. Observers question whether the pause is part of a broader plan to exert psychological pressure on Iran, manipulate international markets, or buy time for intelligence gathering and operational planning. In addition, domestic audiences in the US are closely watching the administration's messaging, weighing the balance between national security, international credibility, and ethical considerations in conducting military operations. Iran declares Trump's claims a fabrication, refuses to halt military action, in a defiant response to US President Donald Trump's assertion of productive talks with Tehran. Iranian officials have vehemently rejected the claims, insisting that the United States is attempting to manipulate global perception with what Tehran calls a fabricated narrative. Senior figures within the Iranian government, including representatives of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, emphasized that no formal or informal discussions have taken place with Washington, and that Iran will continue to defend its sovereignty and respond to any aggression with full force. State media outlets amplified the message, portraying Trump's statements as a strategic ploy intended to distract from ongoing military operations in the region. The Iranian parliament speaker publicly condemned the US narrative, calling it a distortion designed to create the illusion of negotiation while masking real intentions of attack and disruption. Officials warned that any unilateral attempt to present Tehran as negotiating in secret could backfire, potentially escalating tensions and provoking public backlash. Analysts noted that Iran's hardline posture is aimed not only at Washington, but also at domestic audiences, reaffirming the government's image of strength and resilience in the face of external pressure. The denials come amid heightened tensions following weeks of US and allied military activity targeting Iranian infrastructure and leadership sites. While Washington portrays the pause in strikes as a window for diplomacy, Iran insists that the threat to its critical energy and military installations remains imminent. Observers highlight the deep mistrust between the two nations, with each side interpreting the other's actions through the lens of long-standing strategic rivalry. Tehran's refusal to acknowledge any talks adds complexity to efforts by third-party mediators and international stakeholders attempting to prevent full-scale conflict. Regional experts warn that the conflicting narratives are amplifying uncertainty across the Middle East, impacting not only military calculations, but also political and economic stability. The denials have already influenced energy markets, which remain sensitive to any suggestion of escalation. International diplomats have called for transparency and verification, emphasizing that the absence of credible communication could inadvertently trigger further clashes or misinterpretation of military movements. Israeli strikes continue inside Iran despite US pause, raising regional alarm. While the United States announced a temporary halt on planned strikes targeting Iranian energy infrastructure, Israeli forces reportedly continued their offensive operations inside Iran, striking multiple sites including military installations and logistical hubs. According to military analysts, the continuation of Israeli operations highlights the fragmented nature of regional strategy, where US diplomatic pauses do not necessarily translate into coordinated restraint by allied actors. The ongoing strikes have sparked alarm across the region, as local populations face the risk of collateral damage and escalating retaliation. Officials in Tehran condemned the attacks, describing them as violations of Iran's sovereignty and a continuation of aggressive policies aimed at destabilizing the country. Statements from senior military leaders stressed that Israel's actions would not go unanswered, reinforcing Tehran's long-standing warnings of potential retaliation against both regional and international targets. The combination of US pauses and Israeli strikes has created a complex operational environment, leaving analysts and policymakers scrambling to understand the emerging patterns of conflict. The ongoing attacks have also complicated the narrative presented by the Trump administration, which emphasized the potential for diplomacy during the US pause. While Washington seeks to frame the pause as a strategic window for dialogue, the reality on the ground indicates that hostilities continue, underscoring the challenges of aligning allied military actions with political messaging. Regional experts note that these strikes could inadvertently provoke Iran into escalating attacks, even in areas not directly involved in prior confrontations, highlighting the fragile balance between deterrence and provocation. The international community is closely monitoring developments, with neighboring nations and global powers expressing concern over the potential for uncontrolled escalation. Energy and trade corridors, particularly those vital to global oil shipments, remain under scrutiny, as any disruption could have far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate conflict zone. Analysts stress that the continuation of Israeli strikes, despite the US pause, reflects the deep complexity of the Middle East conflict, where multiple actors operate with overlapping agendas, often undermining attempts at de-escalation and leaving the region in a precarious state of uncertainty. Global energy markets react as US pauses strikes on Iran. The announcement of a temporary pause on US strikes targeting Iranian energy infrastructure sent immediate ripples through international markets, triggering sharp movements in oil prices and sparking urgent analysis from investors and policymakers worldwide. Following the White House statement, global benchmarks for crude oil fell significantly, reflecting a cautious optimism that a major disruption to Iran's extensive energy production network might be avoided. Analysts quickly emphasized that while the pause is framed as a diplomatic window, market volatility remains high due to lingering uncertainties regarding the reliability of US claims and Tehran's official denials of contact. Traders reacted to the news with a mix of relief and skepticism. Some interpreted the halt as a strategic move to prevent a spike in energy prices and stabilize global supply chains, while others warned that the announcement might only provide a temporary lull before further military or retaliatory actions. Futures contracts in London and New York saw price fluctuations of several dollars per barrel within hours, underscoring the sensitivity of the market to geopolitical developments in the Middle East. European and Asian energy sectors also responded, as refiners and national suppliers monitored the situation closely. Officials in several major oil-importing countries convened emergency briefings to assess potential disruptions to shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point where even minor conflicts can have outsized effects on global trade. Shipping companies, meanwhile, heightened security protocols for vessels operating in contested waters, reflecting the real-time operational implications of the US-Iran standoff. The pause also influenced broader financial markets. Investors in equities tied to energy and defense sectors reacted to the announcement with sharp fluctuations, reflecting the intertwined nature of geopolitical risk and market performance. Analysts highlighted that while the US move might temporarily calm the market, the lack of verifiable communication from Iran leaves the global economy vulnerable to sudden shocks. Commentators warned that even a single miscalculation could reverse market gains and trigger a ripple effect across interconnected industries. Global leaders and international observers have underscored the urgency of clear and reliable information, emphasizing that market stability depends as much on transparent communication as on physical operational decisions. While US officials highlight the pause as a sign of responsible governance, the Iranian denials of any engagement complicate the narrative, reinforcing the perception of uncertainty that continues to dominate investor sentiment and strategic planning. Iran warns of retaliation if attacked. Conflict risk remains high. Amid announcements of a US pause on strikes targeting Iranian energy infrastructure, Tehran has issued strong warnings that any aggression would be met with decisive retaliation, signaling that the risk of escalation remains acute. Senior Iranian officials and military commanders stressed that sovereignty and national security would not be compromised under external pressure, framing any foreign attack as an invitation for immediate countermeasures. Statements from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps emphasized that Iran maintains a broad network of defensive and offensive capabilities capable of striking both regional and international targets in response to perceived threats. The warnings come in the context of weeks of mounting tension, during which the US and allied forces have conducted operations targeting Iranian military and logistical installations. Iranian leadership characterized the US pause not as a genuine de-escalation, but as a temporary, politically motivated measure, stressing that Tehran's operational readiness remains fully intact. Officials explicitly noted that any miscalculation by Washington or its allies could trigger a rapid military response, underscoring the high stakes inherent in the region's volatile strategic environment. Regional analysts have highlighted the broader implications of Iran's warnings. Gulf nations, dependent on stable energy flows and maritime security, are watching developments closely, aware that misinterpretation or inadvertent provocation could escalate conflict across national borders. Military observers note that Iran's posture serves a dual purpose, deterring immediate strikes while projecting strength to both domestic populations and regional actors. Tehran's messaging also seeks to maintain leverage in any potential diplomatic engagement, signaling that negotiations cannot occur under duress or threat of attack. The international community has responded with calls for caution and clarity. Diplomatic channels remain active, but conflicting narratives from Washington and Tehran complicate efforts to establish verified communication. Analysts emphasize that the current equilibrium is fragile, with the potential for sudden escalation heightened by both misperception and deliberate signaling. The combination of US pauses, Israeli operations, and Iranian readiness has created a highly dynamic operational environment, with observers warning that even minor incidents could trigger a broader conflagration. Financial and energy sectors remain particularly sensitive to these developments, as the threat of retaliation keeps global supply chains on edge. Shipping lanes, power grids, and oil production facilities are all considered potential flashpoints in the event of renewed hostilities. The warnings from Iran have reinforced the sense that while temporary pauses may exist, the underlying conflict dynamics remain unresolved, leaving international actors and markets in a state of heightened alert. White House frames pause as strategic move amid Middle East crisis. The Trump administration presented the temporary halt on strikes in Iran as a calculated decision aimed at reducing tensions and opening a path for potential diplomacy, portraying the pause as evidence of careful strategic leadership. Officials emphasized that the US remains ready to act if necessary, but seeks to avoid unnecessary escalation, framing the move as both pragmatic and responsible. Critics, however, argue the announcement is largely symbolic, aimed at domestic audiences and global markets, while Iran continues military preparations and rejects any claims of talks, leaving observers questioning whether the pause signals genuine de-escalation or merely a tactical PR maneuver. Allies scramble to interpret diverging US-Iranian narratives, as the United States touts a diplomatic pause and Tehran denies any engagement. Regional and global allies are struggling to interpret the rapidly diverging accounts. Diplomats report heightened uncertainty in coordinating responses, with some governments urging restraint and verification, while military planners remain on high alert. The conflicting narratives complicate efforts to stabilize energy markets, shipping lanes, and regional security, creating a climate where miscommunication or miscalculation could spark renewed conflict. Analysts warn that without verifiable communication, allies must navigate an exceptionally volatile situation, where perception may drive decisions as much as actual military movements. Trump's social media claims shake markets and political debate. President Trump's public assertions of productive talks with Iran reverberated across social media and mainstream news, fueling debate over US strategy and credibility. Market analysts reported immediate reactions, with energy stocks fluctuating and global oil futures responding to the perceived de-escalation. Political commentators in Washington highlighted the tension between projecting strength and managing international perception, noting that while Trump's messaging reassures some allies and investors, it risks further inflaming skepticism as Tehran denies any contact, creating a volatile information landscape that influences both policy and market behavior. Analysts warn pause may only delay conflict without verified deals. Experts caution that the US pause in strikes on Iran, framed as an opportunity for diplomacy, carries no guarantee of lasting relief unless backed by verified agreements. The lack of confirmation from Tehran leaves the window of de-escalation fragile, with military analysts warning that even minor provocations could reignite hostilities. Regional powers monitor developments closely, balancing deterrence with caution, while energy markets and shipping lanes remain highly sensitive to any sudden shifts. Observers emphasize that without clear verifiable commitments, the current lull may represent a temporary reprieve, rather than a true resolution. As we've reported tonight, the story is far from simple. From Trump's controversial claims of diplomacy to Tehran's outright denials, from the US pause on strikes to Israeli operations continuing inside Iran, the Middle East remains a powder keg. Global energy markets fluctuate by the hour. Political alliances are navigating an unprecedented fog of conflicting narratives, and analysts warn that without verifiable agreements, this temporary lull may only delay further conflict. Iranian warnings of retaliation underscore that while pauses can exist, the underlying tensions and mistrust remain as potent as ever. From financial markets to regional security, every headline, every tweet, every military movement is being scrutinized, and the world waits to see who will blink first.